Welcome to Lesson 5 of Module 1 and 2. Let's start with our do now. What differentiates a primary source from a secondary source in science? Pause the video now to complete this question. You would know that this is a follow-on from our Lesson 4, where we looked at some secondary sources and how we would undertake research. For here, we're looking specifically at secondary source data and how we would use those in practical investigations. So we're going to be looking at the usefulness of consulting this research to address these following descriptors here. When we talk about primary and secondary sources in science, it may be different to what you refer to in other subjects. So when we look at primary sources, it's original materials that have not been filtered through interpretation or evaluation. So it looks at things like conference papers, lab notebooks, patents, a study reported in a journal article. And then when we're looking at secondary sources, it contains information about a primary source. They tend to come second in the publication cycle, and they're things like review articles or journal articles that reference another paper, not directly using it itself. And when we consult research here, there are 5 reasons that we may consult research. So some of them we'll actually see they form part of our syllabus descriptors. So to avoid unnecessary investigations, to make inferences from other research, to develop inquiry questions, to therefore make sure we're not doubling up on information, to construct hypotheses, and to look at variables where people have identified those in research. And then we can also use research to learn about the research methodologies scientists used and therefore improve our validity and reliability of our results. When we use secondary sources, we're actually looking at an accumulation of knowledge of scientists that have been able to comprehend different research articles and by using this information, there is no need for each scientist to start at the very beginning, and that in fact scientific research can be about contributing to the evolution of scientific knowledge over time. When we look at developing inquiry questions, these are testable questions and questions that come up that arise from observations. So making sure when you're developing your inquiry questions, you make the question specific. And we're usually starting with how does or how will, and looking at things like affect, interact, or change something else. So our 2 missing words here usually are our variables that we're going to look at in our investigation. When we talk about developing our inquiry questions, it's an invitation to think. And therefore, they're open-ended and there's no real final or correct answer. And it just leads us to further investigation. It allows the scientist to think critically, creatively, ethically, productively, and reflectively if the question invites deep thinking, and it can in fact lead to more questions. So making sure that your inquiry question is detailed enough to allow for investigation, but not too specific that it in fact stifles the researcher. So what I want you to undertake now, it doesn't matter where you are watching this video from, you can pause the video, find a quiet place and sit for 5 minutes and list down all the things you observe. When you've written down those observations, I want you to come back inside and construct an inquiry question for each of those different observations you have made. The next part is about writing a hypothesis, and these are developed by making a proposition about how the independent variable and the dependent variable relate to one another. We would have seen in our video previously, we would have looked at the if, then, because structure for writing a hypothesis, and by reviewing secondary sources, we're actually able to see which variables the scientists investigated before us and how these variables may relate to forming a new inquiry question. And then we talked about avoiding unnecessary investigations. So looking at investigations that have been conducted in the past and which have not means that we're not overlapping on our research. It avoids unnecessary repetition and it allows each scientist to make a unique contribution to scientists. Repeating investigations allows us to obviously verify and make sure that the information that is published is accurate, and that by publishing and looking at secondary sources, we are in fact able to look at and make sure that the information we're looking at is correct. Most secondary sources are actually peer reviewed, which means that they've already been looked at by other scientists and verified before they're actually published. So it if you were to repeat information and investigations that you found in secondary sources, it wouldn't mean that you could make a unique contribution. However, sometimes for us in high school science, we're looking at validating and actually making sure that we can also observe what scientists before us have observed. And repeating research is just as important because it does sometimes challenge research that has been done previously. What we're going to look at now is we've looked at secondary sources and what they might be and how we might use those in our investigations. What we're going to do now is we're going to look at this research paper and see if we can find the different sections of that and kind of what it looks like in our first kind of go at looking at journal articles that are published. So pause the video now and complete that activity. And then we have these questions that we can complete in our workbook. And so we're looking at how we might actually look at designing our own investigations. So this forms into our next video that we're going to undertake. So pause the video now to complete these questions based on the information we've learnt so far. And finally, our inquiry question log. So how is secondary source data used in practical investigation?